Right. So here's a question to kick things off. When things get truly difficult, what matters more? Is it having like overwhelming power and ability so you just kind of steamroll the challenge quietly?
Mm,
Or is it something else? The sheer will, the grit, the endurance to keep pushing no matter how much you're hurting or how impossible it seems.
that's a great question. That idea of the knockout punch versus just the ability to outlast and endure, it applies in so many areas, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And that fundamental tension, well, that's what we're diving into today based on some really fascinating sources you've shared with us.
Right.
These sources kind of pull back the curtain on a specific world, looking at how experienced dog men, as they're called, view two key traits in bulldogs, being a destroyer versus having gameness.
Yeah, what's so interesting is how these sources give us this really specific lens. It's not just observing these qualities, but how they're defined, how they're valued, and sometimes, debated within that community.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to unpack these concepts. What are these traits in this context? Why does the distinction matter so much to the people the sources describe?
And crucially, what do the stories, the specific examples in the sources, actually show us about how these traits play out?
Right.
So, okay, diving into this world presented in the sources, where do we start with these terms? Let's maybe tackle the destroyer first.
Okay. So based on the source material, when these individuals talk about a destroyer, what exactly are they describing in a dog?
Well, a destroyer, as the sources explain it, is a dog whose ability is just so superior it wins very quickly, very powerfully.
Ah,
They're often characterized as a killer-type dog or maybe a hard punisher. Their whole thing is overwhelming force that basically ends the contest before it turns into a long, drawn-out battle of wills.
like a force of nature just gets the job done fast. The sources mention names like Chamuco and Badger as examples of this type, noting Badger was a destroyer who apparently never really had to face a test of his gameness.
Precisely. Which leads us right to the other key trait, gameness. And the sources, they treat this with a lot of nuance.
Okay.
Gameness is presented as, well, the willingness to continue despite everything, exhaustion, injury, really overwhelming odds. It's resilience, right? The sheer refusal to quit.
So it's more about internal fortitude, not necessarily the physical dominance part. And the sources even break this down further, don't they?
You do, yeah. They make a distinction between what they call pit gameness, which basically means being game enough to win that specific fight,
Right.
and deep gameness. And deep gameness is described as something potentially more profound, more enduring, a quality that persists even when winning seems impossible. Some even consider it almost
Spiritual.
spiritual. Wow. And we see examples mentioned like Motorhead showing typical intensity or champion game. I mean, the name says it all.
Right. The name really highlights the quality.
And the sources point out this inherent tension, this kind of debate. If you have a destroyer who just wins,
Yeah.
does that deep, enduring gameness even matter as much?
Yeah. The sources note there often comes a point where a serious dog man might prioritize the destroyer's winning ability over a dog whose main virtue is gameness.
That really is the central question these sources seem to explore. If victory is quick, decisive, is that capacity for endless endurance under suffering still relevant?
But the sources don't just leave it there, right? They immediately turn to history, to anecdotes, to kind of challenge that idea.
Exactly. And that starts with the perspective of the old-timers, as the sources call them.
Right.
The sources explain that this older generation of dogmen, they were often skeptical of the early destroyers.
Why was that?
Well, precisely because they hadn't been pushed enough to prove their gameness. They won too fast, too easily, to show what they had when the chips were really down.
Ah, okay. They hadn't truly been tested in the fire, so to speak.
Exactly. And a classic example the sources bring up is Cersei Jeff, way back in the 1940s. He was owned by a Dr. Hall. And Jeff was such a potent destroyer, won his first 2 matches with this. Like, shocking speed. The sources say he nearly decapitated his opponents,
Wow.
which understandably meant Hall couldn't find anyone willing to match against him anymore. So Hall was willing to sell him, but for a pretty penny.
And that's where Bob Wallace comes in. The sources say Wallace paid $1,000 for Jeff back then, which they estimate is like, what, $100,000 today?
Yeah, something like that. A massive investment in one animal.
Huge.
But here's the really critical point from the sources. Despite owning this incredibly valuable dominant dog, Wallace was described as a crank on gameness.
A crank on gameness, meaning...
For him, that quality was absolutely non-negotiable. He wasn't going to build his breeding program around a dog, no matter how successful, if there was any question about its fundamental gameness. He absolutely had to know if Jeff possessed that deep resilience.
So he couldn't just take the wins at face value. He needed proof of something deeper. So what does the source tell us Wallace did to find out? He put that prize dog, that $100,000 dog, to the test.
He did. A serious test. The sources recount how Wallace figured the only way to truly test Jeff was to, well, face him against multiple opponents, one after another.
Oh.
Yeah, he used 3 different larger dogs on Jeff over about an hour. And the sources, they paint this picture of Jeff getting more and more tired, especially by the 3rd dog losing his dominant edge, described as being nearly helpless.
Pushed right to the absolute limit.
To the brink. But this is where the story, as the sources tell it, takes its turn.
Yep.
Despite his physical state, near collapse. When they took that 3rd dog away, Jeff had already made what the sources call impressively game scratches.
Scratches, meaning?
Like a demonstration of the will to continue to engage, even when physically spent.
Yeah.
And not only that, he apparently visibly protested when his opponent was removed.
Wow. So his body was failing, but the will was still absolutely there, fiercely.
That's the key takeaway the sources emphasize. That grueling test, it confirmed Jeff's deep gameness for Wallace. It validated that massive risk and expense.
Right.
And the sources implicitly ask, what does it tell you about the value placed on gameness? That someone like Wallace would risk an animal worth potentially $100,000 today just to prove that one single trait.
It really underscores that for some, it's not just about winning. It's about, well, how you're built, fundamentally.
Yeah.
And the sources follow this up by showing how gameness can sometimes triumph even over seemingly superior ability, right, in the later examples.
They do. Bert Sorrells, another individual mentioned in the sources, he recounts what he calls one of his most thrilling moments involving a dog named Dugan.
Okay, Dugan. How did he compare to the destroyer type? Was he a powerhouse?
No, not at all, according to the sources. Dugan wasn't a hard punisher. He was described more as an adept wrestler, good at staying out of trouble, maybe more strategic than just overwhelming force.
Okay, so definitely not the quick finish type. And who was he up against in this match that Sorrells found so thrilling?
He was matched against a dog described as one of the best in the country, a real powerhouse. And this opponent's ability was initially just too much for Dugan.
How so?
Well, the sources say the opponent nearly immobilized Dugan by crippling his shoulders. It makes it clear Dugan was in serious trouble, really struggling.
So it sounds like a classic case where the dominant, powerful dog should have wrapped it up pretty quickly.
That's certainly how it looked. The sources note that after maybe 45 minutes or so, Dugan basically had no front end working because of the shoulder injuries. He was severely compromised physically. But, and this is what the sources emphasize, he was still full of life and ideas. And then came the turning point. The powerful opponent started running low on gameness.
So the sheer power was there, but when things got really tough, protracted, the enduring will started to fade.
Exactly the point the sources seem to be making. Dugan, injured as he was, found ways to get through the opponent's defenses. He started punishing his adversary, despite his own condition, and eventually he prevailed.
Incredible. And the reaction to this match, as described in the sources, that sounds incredibly telling about how gameness is valued in this community.
Oh, absolutely. The sources say the dog men watching went wild. I mean, actually crying, kicking the side of the pit in ecstasy about the type of gameness they had seen.
Just pure emotion.
Pure emotion. It was this visceral proof right there in front of them that sheer willpower could overcome immense physical disadvantage in the long run. And Dugan, he was voted both best dog and gamest dog after that match.
Both? Wow.
Yeah, showing the profound respect his performance commanded. The sources present this as the match that really solidified Sorrells' own deep respect for gameness, even if he might have leaned towards destroyers before that.
That's a powerful story. And there's another one in the sources that highlights this emotional connection to gameness, especially when facing defeat, right? From Bobby Smith and his dog, Bad Billy.
Yes, Bad Billy. And according to the sources, Bobby Smith actually sought out Bad Billy because he admired destroyers. He wanted that kind of powerful, winning dog.
And Billy delivered.
He did, for a while. Won several matches using this devastating move, lifting opponents by the chest, a classic destroyer tactic.
But then he faced a challenge that kind of neutralized that strength.
Precisely. He was matched against a dog the sources describe as having almost equal ability. But the key factor was the pit floor. It had this tight, slick tarp.
Okay, and that mattered because?
Because when Billy tried his signature chest lifting move, his front legs would just slip out from under him on the tarp. Happened repeatedly. And the sources say it worked so much against him that he was clearly losing the match.
So he wasn't just fighting the other dog, he was fighting the environment, which took away his best weapon.
Yes, exactly. And the sources note Bobby Smith maybe kept him in there a bit too long, hoping for that turnaround, that usual win.
Yeah.
By the end, Billy was described as dead tired and nearly dead.
Victory was absolutely off the table at that point. No way back.
None. And Bobby Smith, by his own account in the sources, he didn't even expect Billy to make a scratch, that final show of will.
But he did.
He did. Bad Billy made what the sources call an incredibly game courtesy scratch, despite being on the verge of collapse.
A courtesy scratch. Just pure will, even in defeat.
Pure will. And that single act, in that moment of undeniable loss, seems to have had an impact that, well, transcended all of Billy's previous victories.
How so? What was the reaction?
The sources recount that this act brought the crowd to its feet, and Bobby Smith himself, to tears. According to the sources, this moment showed Billy had more than just pit game. It was a display of that deeper, maybe spiritual gameness we talked about.
Wow.
And for Bobby Smith, that single act in defeat led him, according to the sources, to exalt Bad Billy above all the other fine dogs he owned in his lifetime.
So even the admired destroyer, pushed to his absolute physical limit and losing, revealed a quality of gameness that the sources suggest was maybe even more revered, more emotionally impactful than his ability to just win.
That certainly seems to be the point these anecdotes are driving home. The author of the source material kind of wraps things up by reiterating that, while everyone, including them, is infatuated with destroyers and their ability to win quickly.
Which is understandable.
Totally understandable. But gameness is described as truly special.
And they highlight that observation, right, that clever game dogs have often surprised and beaten destroyers who maybe seemed unbeatable beforehand.
Yeah, which reinforces the idea that just pure, overwhelming ability isn't always enough when it meets cunning combined with that unwavering will.
Right.
And as we touched on, for some within this world described in the sources, that deep gameness really does take on an almost spiritual trait.
So bringing it back to that initial tension, the sources note dogmen might sometimes consciously decide to focus on the killer-type dogs, the destroyers, and sort of, quote, let the opponent's dog be deep game. But these specific, powerful stories from the sources, particularly the ones ending not in victory but in this profound display of spirit, they really suggest the importance and the impact of gameness can show up in unexpected ways, often with this powerful emotional resonance that just goes beyond winning or losing.
You really drive home that point. While sheer ability might get you the quick wins, the quality that truly captures hearts and earns that lasting, maybe even tearful respect, it might just be that indomitable spirit, the one that refuses to yield even when defeat looks absolutely certain.
So our deep dive into these sources today, it's really shown us that in this specific world, there's this fascinating debate, this tension between the value of overwhelming power being a destroyer and the value of sheer, resilient will having gameness.
Yeah, and while ability is clearly prized, for its effectiveness,
Absolutely.
the sources present these compelling, really emotional examples, suggesting there's this profound respect, maybe even reverence, for that quality of gameness, especially when it's displayed against impossible odds.
We've seen through the specific examples from the sources why experienced individuals argue about which trait is more crucial, and how these real-world stories, they highlight the impact of each, sometimes showing the deep emotional power of perseverance even more vividly than the power of just winning.
Definitely. It's not always about the win itself.
Right. And that leaves us with something powerful for you, the listener, to consider drawing on these insights. If, as the sources suggest, underpinning all that ability that so infatuates dogmen, maybe deep gameness. And given those incredibly powerful emotional reactions we saw when gameness is displayed even in defeat, does true greatness, maybe not just in this specific world, but perhaps beyond, ultimately lie not just in the ability to win, but in that indomitable spirit shown precisely when winning seems impossible?